Welcome back to Sustainability's Leading Voices. Today I'm joined by one of the UK's most prominent ocean conservation campaigners. Hugo Tagholm is the former CEO of Surfers Against Sewage and is now the Executive Director and Vice President of Oceana UK. Welcome, Hugo. Can you introduce us to Oceana?
Oceana, a big organisation, a global organisation working in about 14 countries around the world to protect and restore our ocean at a global scale. Here in the UK, we're starting a new team, really focused on sort of hard-hitting campaigns.
Oceana UK are highly active in campaigning and lobbying on a number of issues. What are the goals of your current focus areas?
Yeah, look, let's just sort of unpack that in terms of the three areas that we're working on. Of course, this issue of fossil fuels and particularly what we're taking out of the North Sea. So our campaign is really to end new offshore oil and gas, and we're seeing some really big ones in terms of developments from the oil and gas industry being proposed at the moment. We've got a current government that's pretty much pro oil and gas. They are looking to extract as much as they can from the North Sea. Rosebank is the biggest of those, an estimated 500 million barrels of oil, a development that would cost the taxpayers hundreds of millions of pounds and bring limited benefits to the UK. It wouldn't help with energy security, it wouldn't help with the cost of living crisis, and it would put a big additional threat to our marine protected areas. It would blow a hole in our climate and biodiversity budgets and commitments. So something we're looking to stop. And then really overall, we need any new government to be committed to ending all new offshore oil and gas developments and really pumping in their energies into the renewable transition and making sure that's done in a just way and done in a sensitive way to protect our blue spaces as much as possible. We're then overall on fisheries, it's fairly straightforward. We need the government to make sure that they only set quotas and fish within sustainable scientific limits. We need that to happen. If not, we're really fishing out various stocks of fish. The fishing community would agree with making sure that their industry needs to be sustainable. And so we need it to be sustainable from an environmental point of view, but also from a local sort of fishing point of view. Those towns and villages that are dependent on fishing, places like Newquay and Newlyn and St Ives and Mevagissey down here in Cornwall, right through to the fishing ports of Scotland and the northeast. We need to make sure that the industry doesn't do itself out of business and that we make sure we're following the science there. And then lastly, on marine protected areas, the government is committed and has led for a long time on this call for 30 by 30% of our land and sea to be protected properly by 2030. And we've got lots of good lines on a map in the UK showing the areas that are held within marine protections, but we need that to be properly implemented and enforced and make sure that destructive activities can't compromise, damage and destroy marine protected areas, which the public think should be properly protected. So those are the three areas, and they're all of increasing importance, and they're all linked to the current climate and biodiversity crises.
You're widely recognised among the sustainability and nature community as a leading voice because of the long-standing track record of success that you've had. Tell us your story.
I actually took quite a convoluted route to getting to where I am. I started my career in communications, in public relations. I worked with a lot of NGOs through that, some environmental, some sort of social NGOs. I then went into the charity sector and worked leading programs in a children's charity with a former Prime Minister's wife, which was amazing, where I learned a lot. I did a lot in the sort of political sphere, and then went into the sort of environmental sector, the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, the wildlife trusts, And then as a surfer, this opportunity to lead SAS came up in 2008, an organization that I'd had a long-term sort of admiration for, but it had fallen on hard times, and I came in to revive it and build it into what it is today, which I'm very proud of. So I spent almost 15 years leading that and building it from just a couple of people into sort of a team of 35, working on multiple issues at a national, local, and sometimes international level. So yeah, it was a good journey. And then the Oceana opportunity came up, and I was looking for a new challenge, and here I am. It's good to be learning from people around the world. Good to be building a new team, and it's an interesting time.
How have the campaigns that you've worked on led to real change?
The exposure which we're seeing in full force today of the water companies' pollution is one that I've spent a lot of time campaigning around to access the data that we need now see as an almost sort of daily news feed. Those maps of sewage bills and pollution is something that SAS pioneered. It's something we spent a long time piloting and bringing to market, from just one or two spots through to hundreds and hundreds around the country. And that was, a huge campaign. This issue, since privatization, has been around, but it needed that data to expose what the water companies were doing. It was pretty dramatic on the graphs because it was only once we got the data that it came to light.
With that data, Surfers Against Sewage were able to build a narrative and win the debate on sewage in our oceans. Now that you're at Oceana, what political priorities are you going to be focusing on?
At the moment, this country is considering green lighting the Rosebank oil field. That will cost taxpayers, I think, about £500 million. It would, of course, create some jobs, but it will put under threat our marine protected areas, some really sensitive areas like the Faroe Shetland sponge belt, these deep sea sponges that take so long to grow that if they're damaged and destroyed, it's unlikely we'll see them come back. We're at home to whales and dolphins and important commercial fish stocks. It's a proposal that will blow a hole in our carbon budget. It's a proposal that will not at all help lower household bills. So there's no cost of living crisis benefits to it, and there's no long-term security to that energy source because it runs out. And so the natural thing and the wise thing for governments to do is really look at where we're going to get clean, green, abundant energy forever.
With the general election coming up next year, we need to keep climate and nature at the top of the agenda to ensure real change from the next government. How do we drive that engagement?
We have to hold their feet to the fire, whoever it may be, on things like the water company scandal, where we're seeing private monopolies making billions of pounds at the expense of the environment, at the expense of the bill payer here in the UK. It's just not a model we can carry on with. And same with the industries like big plastics that are, responsible for the crisis, and they're just outsourcing their pollution. It's easy for them, and it's catching up with them now. All of this single-use packaging, convenient for a few moments, but inconvenient for the planet and communities for arguably ever. And we're seeing so much health data coming out about the potential threat of plastics in the long term to people that the time to act is now. So there's some really big things, but the practical solutions often bring them to life for people. And that's why when people see a sewage spill at their beach, when they see plastic on their beach, when they see the sort of destruction of their coastline, when they see the impacts of oil spills on a seabird, those sorts of things, they really come to life for people. And people need to be able to relate to the issues that they want to see changed.
You mentioned public engagement with issues where change is needed. What do the local communities that you're working with want to see the government prioritising?
We see things domestically in the UK that the public's very engaged with, things like the sewage pollution issue and the agricultural pollution issue, big election topics, and things I'm still involved with in my sort of side hustles. and it's something that is sort of enraging the public because it's very local to them. It's often about the beach they swim or surf at. It's about the places that they love, and it's quite a visible sort of issue at times. Also, people think because of discoloration of the water and all of that side of things. So, for me, there's various sort of touch points on issues that people care about very locally that then grow into a national debate, and then there's some very big issues internationally that are quite far from people's reach, that it's important for organizations like Oceana and other organizations, Greenpeace and Blue Marine Foundation and others, to really bring to the surface and force and challenge policymakers to do better, because if not, the public often will take the approach of out of sight, out of mind.
You've just talked about local issues needing national solutions. Ocean conservation is an international concern. What kind of action is needed at that international level?
It depends on where you're looking. I mean, overall, overfishing is one of the biggest threats to our ocean. Literally, it's extracting biodiversity from our seas. And so it's a huge global threat. The climate crisis, which brings acidification of the seas, sea level rises, sea temperature changes. It's literally changing the composition and chemistry of our ocean, and those are huge issues. The plastic pollution crisis hasn't gone anywhere. Still need major interventions, and I'm heartened to see what's happening with a couple of big international treaties on these issues. The plastics treaty, which is underway, which should help really stop some of that pollution at source in a large way. We've also seen recently the High Seas Treaty, which should help us protect the high seas in a much better way. And some say that we should close the high seas to fishing full stop, which would be an amazing thing to do to let biodiversity recover, and manage our ocean in a better way.
We know that the next government will be the last with the power to create real change before 2030. What should government be prioritising at a local level?
I think local government really needs to think about sort of local sort of planning needs, and how land is used, how new building is allowed, how old buildings are repurposed, what can and can't be connected to the sewer system and our waste systems, local energy generation, and where they can help create more of a local economy with food and suppliers locally. I think what we saw through the sort of pandemic is that the global supply chains are often super fragile, and we saw just that coming into big effect during that time. And resilience, in my opinion, will ultimately come from local communities and how people work together, how they collaborate, how they share, how they minimize waste, how they cooperate with each other, how we build a new way. And we're seeing some brilliant movements like within that, the Transition Town movement. I was pleased to found the Plastic Free Communities movement, which has brought lots of different people together to work in different ways around the country and around the world. And I think people really need to think about that because, local resilience really is fundamental to, ongoing sort of prosperity.
You've talked there about the need for local prosperity and a just transition. What should the next government be doing at a national level?
I would encourage any government now to focus on this green transition, and we've seen it happening. And not that I agree with everything in either place, but we see those green subsidies, and those green benefits coming in to underpin the economy in the US and in Europe. We see them really seeing that as the major driver for the next phase of sort of economic sort of growth or prosperity. And I think the UK, whichever party gets into power, needs to focus on that. They need to link the sustainability and environmental benefits to the growing economy. I think looking at the retrograde sort of exploration of new oil and gas in the North Sea, of underpinning poor performing and damaging industries is the wrong step. We need to now be restoring nature, creating a green energy transition. We need to be looking at industries that are causing too much harm and seeing where they can be replaced with industries that are regenerative and can cause much less harm. So all of those things, because people need jobs and people need of course, wealth and prosperity and well-being, but it can't come at the long-term expense of our planet, and we need to really work that out. So that's the challenge, and we've seen it before around the world where where governments have injected in money into those spaces, and there have been great historic results of national parks and spaces for people of new jobs and ways of doing things, and that's what we need to see after this election, because time is running out to do that, and we can't keep on doing what we've been doing, because we'll get what we've always got, and that is leading to the climate and biodiversity crisis, and there's no piece of evidence that shows otherwise. So anyone who says like this is fine to keep on this course is wrong.
As you say, the scientific evidence is clear and the solutions already exist. But unfortunately, we know that that problem is perpetuated by lobbying from the oil companies.
The government also needs to be bold about the big and insidious influence that happens in Westminster, particularly of oil and gas, and the amount of lobbying that can go on.
I completely agree, and that's one of the reasons why it's essential that organisations like Oceana, which have the political access to push for real change, can put these solutions on the agenda. What does that look like for you in the run-up to the next election?
I'm talking to politicians in the run-up to what will be the general election manifestos, and we'll be campaigning a lot, in and around the general election period when we can, to call for whichever government comes in to do the right thing for the planet.
You've been active at both ends of the campaigning spectrum, from out there in the ocean on your surfboard to walking alongside the king talking about these issues. Most people don't understand lobbying and campaigning at that level and really how it works. Can you talk us through that?
You've got to have the right balance of outside activities with inside activities, of the sort of outside the political like hubs, and then inside them too. You can campaign with a placard and a gas mask as much as you can campaign in a suit and tie when you need to, because sometimes you have to adopt their language and get inside, because you can't always be outside. And so you need all of these components for good ocean campaigning. And I'm equally comfortable myself in a suit and tie or a wetsuit, really. I prefer the latter to the former, but I think you've got to be able to influence hearts and minds where they're at. You've got to be taken seriously and be respected wherever you're at. And that will mean different things. You're not going to be taken seriously and respected on a beach in a suit and tie talking to grassroots campaigners. But equally, if you wear shorts and flip-flops to a meeting with ministers in Westminster, you might not be taken so seriously either. So you've got to think about how you're doing things and how you alternate between these different campaigning techniques on oil and gas, on plastics, on water quality, on fisheries, all of these things. And I think we've got to be clear about being bold and very values based in what we want with all of these things. Like, no sort of flip-flopping. The science is clear on pretty much all of these issues. Don't get broadsided. You've got to keep repeating. You've got to keep going. You've got to keep committed to what you're doing on whatever you're doing, because often governments particularly will want to wear you out through consultations and other things. Wait until the storm blows over, wait until the public's moved on to something else because they got bored of it. And we see that time and time again. And so you mustn't let that happen as a campaigner. You've got to keep going. And sometimes the press and the media are really interested, like we've seen on plastics and water quality and climate. And sometimes they lose interest, as we've seen on plastics. It's like, 3 years ago, you couldn't help but say anything on plastics and it'd be on the front page of pretty much every newspaper. That's not the case now. At the moment, you can pretty much say anything on sewage pollution and it will get into the papers. But in a year or two's time, that won't be the case. The question is can we shift it far enough for true solutions to come in on any of these issues?
You've talked about the solutions and how we make them happen. Why should this be a priority now?
We're seeing our ocean warmer than it's ever been before. This heat spike. We're seeing forests in Canada burning. We're seeing wildfires in Scotland. We're seeing a decline in biodiversity across the board. And it's now time to not engineer our way out of this problem with just tech solutions, but let nature do its thing and use nature to restore the balance on planet ocean.
Thank you, Hugo, for joining me and sharing such an insightful conversation on ocean conservation. We're continuing the conversation over on Twitter and Threads during the Ethical Hour chat happening now. Come and join us, and we'll be back next week for another episode of Sustainability's Leading Voices.